It was the most coveted award you could get in my high school, and you know, I used to get in trouble a lot. I daydreamed.
Picture this: Patti Smith, wrapped in her long black coat, walking through a quiet New York alley in the fading dusk. Her notebook tucked under her arm, her boots scuffing the pavement like punctuation marks. She is thinking not about herself, but about them. The artists who sparked something in her. The voices that kept her wild heart beating. She doesn't admire casually. Her praise is earned, scraped from honesty, soaked in memory. These 5 musicians didn't just influence Patti, they ignited her. It begins, of course, with the prophet she once called a brother, Bob Dylan. For Patti, Dylan wasn't just a musician. He was scripture. His early lyrics were fire, abstract, spiritual, merciless. She first heard, "A hard rain's a-gonna fall," while sitting on the floor of a college dorm, tears running down her face. That voice didn't ask for permission. It commanded your soul. It made her feel less alone in her anger, in her questions, in her raw, unpolished need to say something that mattered. Years later, when they met, it wasn't about fame, it was about reverence. Patti approached him not as a peer, but as a disciple. He nodded, half grinned, said little, but his presence felt like scripture being read aloud. That brief exchange, awkward, sacred, echoed in her for days. She wrote about it in her journals like a priest recording a vision. Their bond wasn't loud. It was quiet, strange, magnetic. They crossed paths over the years at events and rehearsals, always with mutual respect, always with a knowing glance. Once, backstage at a benefit concert in the 90s, she found herself sitting beside him, both sipping coffee in silence. He said, "You still write with fire." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. That moment felt like an anthem. For her, Dylan cracked the world open. He made it okay to be fierce and poetic. He gave her permission to live between the sacred and the profane, to speak in tongues no one had translated yet. And every time she steps to the mic, a piece of him steps with her. Next, the thunder behind the fury, Keith Richards. If Dylan was scripture, Keith was sacrament. Patti never cared about Polish. She cared about truth. And in Keith's guitar, she heard the gospel of rawness. The Rolling Stones didn't just play rock, they bled it. And Keith, with his broken teeth and cigarette growl, was the engine of it all. He wasn't just a guitarist. He was a force of nature, erratic, electric, divine in his destruction. They met in a smoky backstage room in the late 70s. She told him he looked like a ghost that had survived a war. He just laughed, lit another cigarette, and offered her a drink. What followed wasn't conversation, it was communion. They spoke in fragments, riffs, half-finished quotes from Rimbaud and Chuck Berry.
Lenny K. Richard Soul and I, and the other band members came in at the end. We had already formed.
She saw in him a kindred beast, a man who channeled pain into rhythm, who never apologized for being feral. That night, she wrote 3 poems. All of them burned, not with grief, but with adrenaline. Keith reminded her that rock wasn't meant to behave. It was meant to roar. And when she later recorded her rawest, most jagged tracks, his ghost was there, grinning in the distortion. Then came the flame-haired spirit she called her twin, Janice Joplin. They never met, but Patti grieved her like family. She once said Janice sang like she was fighting to stay alive. That voice, rough, broken, honest, told Patti that it was okay to be unpolished. That being too much was better than not being enough. Janice didn't just sing. She bled. She didn't perform. She unleashed. There was something in Janice Whale that felt like a storm cracking open the soul. Patti could feel it in her chest, a tremor that echoed through her ribs. When she first heard Ball and Chain, she sat frozen on her mattress, tears streaming, heart pounding, like she'd just discovered a long-lost sister through static and vinyl. That voice wasn't music, it was survival. Patti would listen to Janice alone in her apartment, lights dimmed, incense burning, tears silently falling down her cheeks. It wasn't just admiration, it was kinship. Two women too wild for their time, too emotional for the industry, too complicated to package. Janice taught Patti that fragility could be armor, that pain could be a kind of power, that screaming wasn't a breakdown. It was a language. She imagined Janice backstage, surrounded by chaos, drowning in noise, but still alone. Patti felt that same loneliness in crowded green rooms, that same ache of being celebrated and misunderstood all at once. There was a ghostliness to Janice's presence, raw and radiant and already fading. It made Patti write more recklessly, live more urgently, scream more freely. In every howl, every scream, every drunk, defiant slur a lyric. Patti found courage. It made her want to scream louder, write deeper, love harder. When she covered Piece of My Heart at a small club in 1980, she wept mid-song. Not out of sorrow, but out of recognition. It felt like reaching across time to hug someone she'd never met, but always known. Janice was a warning and a blessing, a tragedy wrapped in triumph, a woman whose fire burned too hot for the world to hold. And every time Patti howls into a microphone, she sends that howl into the sky, just in case Janice is still listening. The fourth was a monk in rhythm, Col Train. Most wouldn't expect him on her list. But for Patti, Col Train wasn't just jazz. He was revelation. His sound was spiritual violence, a fierce meditation screamed through a saxophone. It was music that didn't just ask questions. It demanded answers. Patti used to sit in her East Village apartment, lights off, incense curling into the ceiling, playing A Love Supreme on repeat until the room itself seemed to vibrate. She felt like he wasn't just playing notes. He was ripping holes in the fabric of reality. Col Train showed her that chaos could be holy, that dissonance could be devotion. He was the only man she ever said taught her how to pray. She would lie flat on the floor, her hands open, her eyes closed, listening to the way he broke through melody. His runs weren't technical flourishes. They were rituals. He could find pain in a single phrase, then drown it in a flurry of impossible notes. Patti often said that Col Train played like a man trying to get free, not just from the page, but from his own body. She wrote her first spoken word piece while listening to Col Train. The rhythm wasn't poetic meter. It was breath, pulse, sweat. His notes taught her silence. His chaos taught her structure. His pain taught her beauty. His music was less performance and more incantation. They never met. But in her dreams, they sometimes do. She once said that in her quietest moments, she can hear his horn behind her poems, like a ghost guiding her pen. He was jazz, but he was also scripture, different from Dylan's poetry. Col Train was devotion and sound. When Patti sought clarity, she turned to Dylan. When she needed faith, she turned to Col Train. And finally, the one who helped her live again, Kurt Cobain. He came years later, a child of noise and numbness. But in his voice, Patti heard her own youth echoed back. When Nirvana broke through, she didn't see grunge. She saw prophecy. Kurt's voice wasn't polished or perfect. It cracked in all the right places. It didn't reach for beauty. It clawed at truth. She listened to Smells Like Teen Spirit in a hotel room in London and said it felt like being hit in the chest. But it was something in the way that undid her. It was less a song than a wound that hummed. She saw the same things in him she saw in her younger self. Loneliness masquerading as anger, poetry hiding under distortion, and a quiet plea for the world to just listen without trying to fix him. They never met in person, but they shared letters, brief, strange, bruised things. In one, he thanked her for horses. In another, she mailed him a single line from Rimbaud. "I is someone else." He never wrote back, but she didn't expect him to. After his death, Patti lit a candle and wrote a prayer. She called it Grief for a Boy I Never Held. It was short, She has never shared it publicly, but friends say she reads it every year on April 5th and places a copy of Bleach near her typewriter. She feels him still, in feedback, in vulnerability, in rage that asks for nothing but to be heard. And when the lights dim and her voice breaks just before the verse, that's when Kurt is closest, still burning, still misunderstood, still sacred. Patti Smith was never interested in stars. She worshipped truth, the kind that echoes through basement clubs and empty notebooks, the kind that doesn't ask for applause. It demands understanding. The artists who touched her most weren't always the loudest, but the realest. The ones who broke rules, not records. The ones who made music, not to entertain, but to survive. These 5 didn't hand her inspiration. They handed her permission to scream, to stumble, to speak in unfinished sentences and unsung prayers. They reminded her that art doesn't live in perfection. It lives in persistence, in pain, in rawness you can't fake. They didn't inspire her to copy. They dared her to burn, to dig deeper, to stay strange, to write when no one was listening and sing when her voice cracked. They were the ghosts in her typewriter, the fire in her throat, the rhythm in her stride as she walked alone through the night. Because for Patti Smith, music was never a career. It was communion, a secret shared between souls who knew the weight of silence, a rebellion against polish, a sacred ritual of breaking and becoming. And these 5, they weren't just favorites. They were her sacred circle. She doesn't play them to remember. She plays them to feel. Because the flame they lit in her never went out. It simply changed form. And in her poetry, her songs, her silence, they live forever.